Welcome to session 4 of our study on the Second Book of Maccabees and the Apocrypha. Today we begin with a brief review and then we discuss chapters 8, 9, and the first 8 verses of chapter 10. We'll finally hear the story of the revolt of Judas Maccabaeus and the purification of the temple. But first we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The first 2 chapters of Second Maccabees consisted mostly of letters that the Jews of Jerusalem had sent to Jews in Egypt, encouraging them to participate in the celebration of Hanukkah, a commemoration of the purification and rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. Chapter 3 provided a bit of prehistory when things were going well in Jerusalem and its temple. Onias, the righteous high priest, and Secund IV, a mostly benevolent king. When Helidorius attempted to remove some of the treasures from the temple, he was met with God's angels who protected the temple by flogging him until he was nearly dead. Onias was a good high priest, and God protected his temple. In chapter 4, we learn that Secund has been assassinated and replaced on the throne by his younger brother Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Onias' brother Jason bribed the new king to attain the high priesthood for himself and brought Hellenism to the land of Judea, introducing Greek practices and a gymnasium, throwing out the old Mosaic or Jewish laws to be replaced by Greek law. Jason, in turn, was outbid in his bribery of the king and was replaced as high priest by Menelaus, the brother of Simon. Menelaus stole gold vessels and other valuables from the temple that he was supposed to be protecting and carried out other atrocities as Onias, the high priest in exile, was assassinated. God was not pleased at this. In the next few chapters, God shows his displeasure and seems to use Antiochus as an instrument to discipline the Jews of Jerusalem. After Antiochus invades Egypt with some success, a rumor emerges that he has been killed in battle. Jason is emboldened to attempt a military coup in Jerusalem and to retake the high priesthood. He fails, and he escapes to Egypt, where he dies a forgotten man. When Antiochus heard about Jason's attack on Jerusalem, he interpreted this military action as the beginning of a revolt against the Secund Empire. In response, he marched his troops into Jerusalem and began slaughtering the Jews. With the help of the high priest Menelaus, Antiochus raided the temple and stole sacred vessels and other treasures. And God sent no angels to protect the temple this time because of his displeasure with the Jews in Jerusalem. When he left town, Antiochus appointed a new governor, Philip, who was even more barbarous than Antiochus. We're told that Judas Maccabaeus and a few friends escaped into the wilderness at this point. In chapter 6, we're told that the new governor, Philip, tortured and killed women who circumcised their children and burned those who attempted to observe the Sabbath. In a short theological digression, the author explained that it was a kindness that God disciplines his people, the Jews, before they go too far. God lets the foreigners have enough rope to hang themselves, but not so the Jews. We hear the story of Eleazar, an elderly scribe who allowed himself to be tortured to death rather than consume pork, which Jewish law forbade him to eat. In chapter 7, we read the story of the martyrdom of the 7 brothers and their mother, who were also tortured and killed because of their refusal to abandon Jewish law. So we begin now with 2 Maccabees chapter 8. Meanwhile, Judas, who is called Maccabaeus, and his companions secretly entered the villages and summoned their kindred and enlisted those who had continued in the Jewish faith. And so they gathered about 6,000. They implored the Lord to look upon the people who were oppressed by all and to have pity on the temple that had been profaned by the godless, to have mercy on the city that was being destroyed and about to be leveled to the ground, to hearken to the blood that cried out to him, to remember also the lawless destruction of the innocent babies and the blasphemies committed against his name, and to show his hatred of evil. Now, the first book of Maccabees tells us a little bit more about the Judas Maccabaeus' family. Judas' father was Mattathias, who was a member of a priestly family, but not the high priest. Mattathias had 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, each of whom plays a significant role in First Maccabees, but not in Second Maccabees. Here we're going to hear mostly about Judas, sometimes just called Maccabeus. Let's go on with verse 5. As soon as Maccabeus got his army organized, the nations could not withstand him, for the wrath of the Lord had turned to mercy. Coming without warning, he would set fire to towns and villages. He captured strategic positions and put to flight not a few of the enemy. He found the nights most advantageous for such attacks, and talk of his valor spread everywhere. Verse 5 tells us that the wrath of the Lord has turned into mercy. In session 3, we heard about God's displeasure with the Jews and how he had allowed the temple to be pillaged by Antiochus and the people to be slaughtered and made martyrs. But now they have suffered enough, and a new protagonist, Judas Maccabaeus, has emerged. The strategy that Judas adopts is classic guerrilla warfare, featuring sudden attacks and ambushes under cover of night. Being familiar with the terrain, the Judean soldiers had the advantage over the Seleucid forces. So we go on. Verse 8. When Philip saw that the man was gaining ground little by little, and that he was pushing ahead with more frequent successes, he wrote to Ptolemy, the governor of Coelesyria and Phoenicia, to come to the aid of the king's government. Then Ptolemy promptly appointed Nicanor, son of Patroclus, one of the king's first friends, and sent him in command of no fewer than 20,000 men of various nations to wipe out the entire people of Judea. He associated with him Gorgas, a general and a man of experience in military service. Nicanor determined to make up for the king the tribute due to the Romans, 2,000 talents, by selling the captured Jews into slavery. So he immediately sent to the towns on the seacoast, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to hand over 90 slaves for a talent, not expecting the judgment from the Almighty that was about to overtake him. We are told the objective of Nicanor's campaign was first to exterminate the entire Jewish race, and secondly to pay off the tribute owed to the Romans related to the Treaty of Apama from back in 188. Complete suppression rather than extermination was probably the real objective, and slavery was a means to that end. So Nicanor took orders for slaves he expected to capture and took money up front for delivery at a later date. Verse 12. Word came to Judas concerning Nicanor's invasion, and when he told his companions of the arrival of the army, those who were cowardly and distrustful of God's justice ran off and got away. Others sold all their remaining property and at the same time implored the Lord to rescue those who had been sold by the ungodly Nicanor before he ever met them. If not for their own sake, then for the sake of the covenants made with the ancestors and because he had called them by his holy and glorious name. But Maccabeus gathered his forces together to the number 6,000 and exhorted them not to be frightened by the enemy and not to fear the great multitude of nations who were wickedly coming against them, but to fight nobly, keeping before their eyes the lawless outrage that the nations had committed against the holy place and the torture of the derided city, as well as the overthrow of their ancestral way of life. For they trust to arms and acts of daring, he said, but we trust in the Almighty God, who is able with a single nod to strike down those who are coming against us, and even if necessary, the whole world. Moreover, he told them of the occasions when help came to their ancestors, how in the time of Sennacherib, when 185,000 perished, and in the time of the battle against the Galatians that took place in Babylonia, when 8,000 Jews fought along with 4,000 Macedonians. Yet when the Macedonians were hard-pressed, the 8,000, by the help that came to them from heaven, destroyed 120,000 Galatians and took a great amount of plunder. So the Galatians Judas referred to were Gauls from Western Europe who arrived in Asia Minor in 278 BCE, and Jewish forces may have assisted Antiochus I against their invasions. So by Macedonians, he probably means Antiochus and his subjects who were part of the empire founded by Alexander the Great, who was from Macedonia. He is telling his troops, your ancestors have fought against greater odds. We can do that as well. Verse 21. With these words, he filled them with courage and made them ready to die for their laws and their country. Then he divided his army into 4 parts. He appointed his brothers also, Simon and Joseph and Jonathan, each to command a division, putting 1,500 men under each. Besides, he appointed Eleazar to read aloud from the Holy Book and give the watchword. The help of God, then, leading the first division himself, he joined battle with Nicanor. With the Almighty as their ally, they killed more than 9,000 of the enemy and wounded and disabled most of Nicanor's army and forced them all to flee. They captured the money of those who had come to buy them as slaves. After pursuing them for some distance, they were obliged to return because the hour was late. It was the day before the Sabbath, and for that reason they did not continue their pursuit. When they had collected the arms of the enemy and stripped them of their spoils, they kept the Sabbath, giving great praise and thanks to the Lord, who had preserved them for that day and allotted it to them as the beginning of mercy. After the Sabbath, they gave some of the spoils to those who had been tortured and to the widows and orphans, and distributed the rest among themselves and their children. When they had done this, they made common supplication and implored the merciful Lord to be wholly reconciled with his servants. So Simon and Jonathan, listed in verse 21, were Judas's brothers. It's not clear who Joseph was. This may mean the other brother John, or that there was a Josephus who had Judas left in charge of Jerusalem at a later time. It may have been him. We don't read much about the battle itself. In verse 27, we read the prayer to the Lord to be fully reconciled with his servants. Verse 30. In encounters with the forces of Timothy and Bacchides, they killed more than 20,000 of them and got possession of some exceedingly high strongholds, and they divided a very large amount of plunder, giving to those who had been tortured, and to the orphans and widows, and also to the aged, shares equal to their own. They collected the arms of the enemy and carefully stored all of them in strategic places. The rest of the spoils they carried to Jerusalem. They killed the commander of Timothy's forces, a most wicked man, and one who had greatly troubled the Jews. While they were celebrating the victory in the city of their ancestors, they burned those who had set fire to the sacred gates. Calinthuses and some others who had fled into one little house. So these received the proper reward for their impiety. The thrice accursed Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 merchants to buy the Jews, having been humbled with the help of the Lord by opponents whom he regarded as the least account, took off his splendid uniform and made his way alone like a runaway slave across the country until he reached Antioch, having succeeded chiefly in the destruction of his own army. So he who had undertaken to secure tribute for the Romans by the capture of the people of Jerusalem proclaimed that the Jews had a defender, and that therefore the Jews were invulnerable because they followed the laws ordained by him. Verses 30 through 33 about the battle with Timothy and Bacchides are clearly out of place here. These battles came at a different time, but the author is less concerned about the chronological order than the theological picture he is painting of the Maccabean struggle. So we go on to chapter 9 and our old friend Antiochus IV Epiphanes. About that time, as it happened, Antiochus had retreated in disorder from the region of Persia. He had entered the city called Persepolis and attempted to rob the temples and control the city. Therefore the people rushed to the rescue with arms, and Antiochus and his army were defeated, with the result that Antiochus was put to flight by the inhabitants and beat a shameful retreat. While he was in Ecbatana, news came to him of what had happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timothy. Transported with rage, he conceived the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to flight. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. But the judgment of heaven rode with him. For in his arrogance he said, "When I get there, I will make Jerusalem a cemetery of Jews." The order of events in verses 1 through 12 of this chapter differs from that given in First Maccabees. The major difference is that the death of Antiochus, which we will read about in the next few verses, is described before the Maccabean recovery of the temple, which we read about in chapter 10. In fact, the two events were almost contemporary at the end of 164 BCE. There is a collection of letters in chapter 11 in which a letter from the son of Antiochus IV, mentioning his father's death, is improperly inserted. That may account for the confusion and the misordering of events in this chapter. Let's go on to verse 5. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and invisible blow. As soon as he stopped speaking, he was seized with a pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures. And that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many and strange inflictions. Yet he did not in any way stop his insolence, but was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to drive even faster. And so it came about that he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. Thus he who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman arrogance that he could command the waves of the sea and had imagined that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance, was brought down to earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms, and while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away, because of the stench the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. Because of his intolerable stench, no one was able to carry the man who a little while before had thought that he could touch the stars of heaven. Then it was that, broken in spirit, he began to lose much of his arrogance and to come to his senses under the scourge of God, for he was tortured with pain every moment. And when he could not endure his own stench, he uttered these words: "It is right to be subject to God. Mortals should not think that they are equal to God." So this story also illustrates the Greek idea of hubris, violence to others based on pride, which meets its nemesis, divine vengeance. There is a dreadful inevitability about this sequence of events. He who wanted to be more than a man ended as rotting flesh as a result of his own insolence, pretension, and arrogance. This passage is a Greek tragedy in miniature. Go on to verse 13. When the abominable fellow made a vow to the Lord who would no longer have mercy on him, stating that the holy city, which he was hurrying to level to the ground and to make a cemetery, he was now declaring to be free. And the Jews whom he had not considered worthy burying, but had planned to throw out with their children for the wild animals and the birds to eat, he would make all of them equal to the citizens of Athens. And the holy sanctuary, which he had formerly plundered, he would adorn with the finest offerings. And all the holy vessels he would give back many times over, and the expenses incurred for the sacrifices he would provide from his own revenues. And in addition to all this, he would also become a Jew and would visit every inhabited place to proclaim the power of God. But when his sufferings did not in any way abate, for the judgment of God had justly come upon him, he gave up all hope for himself and wrote to the Jews the following letter in the form of a supplication. This was its contents. To his worthy Jewish citizens, Antiochus their king in general sends hearty greetings and good wishes for their health and prosperity. If you and your children are well and your affairs are as you wish, I am glad as my hope is in heaven. Now I was feeling weak, and so I was remembering with affection your esteem and goodwill. On my way back from the region of Persia, I suffered an annoying illness, and I have deemed it necessary to take thought for the general security of all. I do not despair of my condition, for I have good hope of recovering from my illness. But I observed that my father, on the occasions when he made expeditions into the upper country, appointed his successor, so that if anything unexpected happened or unwelcome news came, the people throughout the realm would not be troubled, for they would know to whom the government was left. Moreover, I understand how the princes along the borders and the neighbors of my kingdom keep watching for opportunities and waiting to see what will happen. So I have appointed my son Antiochus to be king, whom I have often entrusted and commended to most of you when I hurried off to the upper provinces. And I have written to him the appended letter. I therefore urge and beg you to remember the public and private services rendered to you and to maintain your present goodwill, each of you toward me and my son, for I am sure that he will follow my policy, and will treat you with moderation and kindness. So the murderer and blasphemer, having endured the more intense suffering such as he had inflicted on others, came to the end of his life by a most pitiable fate, among the mountains in a strange land. And Philip, one of his courtiers, took his body home. Then, fearing the son of Antiochus, he withdrew to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt. The tragedy ends with Antiochus' remorse and attempts at restitution. But in true tragic style, Antiochus has by his own arrogance brought upon himself a fate which even submission to God cannot alter. This underlying Greek understanding of Antiochus' fate is given Jewish clothing by the author, who speaks of God's control over the king's fate and of God's just judgment. The letter, which seems designed to introduce Antiochus V to loyal and friendly subjects as the successor to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, would be inappropriate in Judea in 164 BCE. It may have been written for the people of Antioch, if it was in fact even written by Antiochus IV. According to First Maccabees, Philip attempted to take over the government in Antioch, was later defeated by Lysias, who was Antioch V's guardian, and then went to Egypt. Josephus, however, in Antiquities, says that he was killed by Antiochus V. So we begin chapter 10, and we'll read the first 8 verses. Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple in the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by foreigners and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice. Then, striking fire out of flint, they offered sacrifices after a lapse of 2 years, and they offered incense and lighted lamps and set out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they fell prostrate and implored the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortune, but that if they should ever sin, they might be disciplined by him with forbearance and not be handed over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. It happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place, that is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Chislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also palm fronds, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of Jews should observe these days every year. The purification of the sanctuary took place on the 25th of Chislev, which would have been December 164 BCE, exactly 2 years after the Seleucids had captured the temple and debased it. The author here tries to explain the ceremonial of the new feast by reference to a celebration of tabernacles, or the booths, by the Maccabees in their desert period. While Judas has recovered the temple, the city was still under the control of the Syrian garrison, so it's not likely that they did anything with the altars in the public square. Verse 8 here refers to the whole nation of Jews. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of Jews should observe these days every year. So the author is concerned with foreign as well as Palestinian Jews. This is the celebration that the first 2 chapters of this book are concerned with. In session 5, we'll read the balance of chapters 10. We'll read chapter 11 and chapter 12. We'll read and discuss the campaign against Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and we'll see the return of Nicanor and several other campaigns of Judas Maccabaeus. Our next discussion will be Thursday, January 26th at 6:30 p.m. If you'd like to participate, don't forget to let me know. You can send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org, and I'll send you the Zoom link. Have a good week.